The oldest diner in Cedar Ridge had never seen a morning like this one. Elijah Monroe, a black single father, sat quietly by the window finishing his breakfast when Sheriff Walter Grissom walked in, stopped directly in front of his table, and told him to get up like he owned the floor beneath it. When Elijah calmly refused, Grissom called him suspicious, demanded his identification, and cuffed him in front of more than 40 stunned witnesses. Nobody said a word, though everyone in that room knew Grissom had never once treated a white customer that way at that exact table. At 8 o'clock sharp, Elijah's phone began to ring. Grissom smirked and answered it himself, certain he was in control. He had no idea who was on the other end. "Stay with me, because the person on that call is about to turn this sheriff's entire world upside down. Subscribe now so you don't miss a single second of what happens next." Elijah Monroe had learned a long time ago that the way people looked at him usually said more about them than it ever said about him. At 41, he carried himself with the kind of stillness that made loud men uncomfortable, because stillness is harder to provoke than anger. And Elijah had built his entire adult life around never giving anyone the satisfaction of watching him lose control. 3 years earlier, his wife Renee had died of cancer. And in the quiet that followed, he had raised their daughter Zoe alone, one bedtime story and one school pickup at a time. Renee used to tell him that raising a strong daughter wasn't enough, that Zoe also needed to know she never had to shrink herself just to make someone else comfortable. That sentence had followed Elijah into every room he'd walked into since. 11 days before he ever set foot in Cedar Ridge, Elijah had been sworn in as the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It was the kind of appointment that made headlines, the kind that came with security details and press briefings and a level of scrutiny he'd spent his entire career preparing for. But he hadn't come to Cedar Ridge wearing that title. He'd come quietly, almost invisibly, because the Bureau had received 4 separate letters over 8 months describing a pattern that couldn't be ignored, and Elijah wanted to see the town with his own eyes before he decided whether it deserved a full federal inquiry. He told no one in the local office he was coming. If word leaked that the newly appointed director was sniffing around Cedar Ridge, any witness willing to talk might suddenly lose their nerve, and any evidence that could be hidden would be hidden before he got close to it. So he drove himself alone with nothing but a scheduled safety check-in call to mark the hours, because this was a quiet visit, not a federal operation, and quiet visits didn't come with convoys. The letters all described the same town, wearing 2 different faces. Black drivers and out-of-towners stopped far more often than anyone else. People asked for identification without having broken any law. Those who objected labeled aggressive or uncooperative. Cash and tools that vanished from evidence rooms without ever being fully logged. People taken into custody who were never given the chance to call their families. Complaints filed against the department that seemed to disappear from the system entirely. And every single letter pointed back to one man, Sheriff Walter Grissom, who had run Cedar Ridge for 19 years. Grissom never used the kind of language that would get him in trouble. He was smarter than that. He talked about protecting the community, about people who didn't belong here, about trusting a lawman's instinct over paperwork. But his instincts, whenever they surfaced, almost always pointed toward the same kinds of people. The poor, the black, the ones without anyone powerful standing behind them. Before Elijah left for Cedar Ridge, he'd promised Zoe he would video call her at 8 o'clock that morning, right before her first big presentation at school. She'd been nervous about it for days, not because of the assignment itself, but because a classmate had told her that her father didn't look like someone who could run the FBI. Elijah hadn't answered that with anger. "You never have to prove your own worth through my title," he'd told her. "But when someone judges you before they understand you, don't ever let their silence become your truth." That conversation stayed with him the entire drive into town, because the call at 8 was not just a promise between a father and his daughter. It was also the safety check-in his position required, which meant that single phone call carried 2 different kinds of weight at once. Around 7:15 that morning, Elijah walked into the oldest diner in Cedar Ridge. He wore an old jacket, a gray sweater, jeans, and work boots. Nothing that suggested he held one of the most powerful positions in the country. A waitress named Carol Bennett told him he could sit wherever he liked, and he chose the second table by the window, the one with a clear view of the police station across the street. He ordered eggs, bacon toast, and black coffee, and settled in with the kind of patience that came from years of waiting rooms and long flights. Around 7:40, Walter Grissom walked in with two deputies trailing behind him. Roy Duncan was older, a longtime deputy who'd spent years quietly enabling whatever Grissom wanted done. Jason Pierce was younger, the kind of officer who still had a conscience, but hadn't yet found the courage to use it against his own boss. The moment Grissom stepped through the door, conversation in the diner dropped to a hush, the way a room quiets when everyone already knows who holds the power in it. He walked straight to Elijah's table and stopped in front of it, like he owned the floor beneath it. "You're sitting at my table," Grissom said. Elijah looked up without any urgency. "The waitress told me I could sit anywhere. I'll be gone as soon as I finish eating." Grissom's eyes moved over the plain clothes, lingering just long enough to make the judgment obvious. "What do you do for a living?" "I work for the federal government," Elijah answered simply. Grissom let out a short laugh. "What branch of the government hires people who dress like that?" A few nervous chuckles rippled through nearby tables, not because the joke was funny, but because laughing felt safer than staying silent in front of the sheriff. An older white man 2 tables away spoke up, mentioning that he'd sat in that same seat just last week, and Grissom had greeted him with nothing but a friendly nod. Grissom ignored him completely and turned back to Elijah. "Folks around here know who this table belongs to," Grissom said. "Outsiders ought to learn a little respect." Elijah set his fork down slowly. "Are you asking me to leave because this is your table, or because you don't like the idea of someone like me sitting at it?" The room went completely silent. Grissom didn't answer the question directly. "Don't turn this into something it isn't." "The way you're treating me is exactly what's turning it into something," Elijah replied. Grissom's jaw tightened and something shifted behind his eyes. The look of a man who suddenly realized he was being watched by an entire room instead of just one customer. Rather than back down, he doubled down, announcing that Elijah's behavior was suspicious and that he was now obstructing a police officer. "Since when does eating breakfast and declining to give up a public table count as obstruction?" Elijah asked in the same calm voice he'd used the whole conversation. Grissom's answer was to order him to stand up. Elijah placed his fork down completely and spoke clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I'm unarmed. I'm not resisting. My wallet is in my right jacket pocket." He said it not out of fear, but out of instinct, the same instinct that had guided him through every uncertain room in his career. The instinct to make the facts impossible to distort later. Grissom never reached for the wallet. He never even glanced toward the pocket Elijah had just named. Instead, he looked Elijah directly in the eye. "Men like you always say you're not looking for trouble right before trouble finds you anyway." Nobody in the diner needed the sentence explained to them. Roy Duncan pulled Elijah up from his chair and cuffed his wrists tighter than the situation required, the metal biting into his skin as he was walked toward the door. In that moment, Elijah could have said 4 words that would have ended everything instantly. He could have told them exactly who he was. But this was not some reckless plan he'd walked in with that morning. It was a decision he made in the space of a few seconds, because he noticed Jason Pierce's body camera was still recording, because more than 40 people were watching this unfold, and because Walter Grissom was recreating almost exactly everything those 4 letters had described months earlier. If Elijah revealed his identity right then, Grissom would simply apologize, call it a misunderstanding, and the truth those letters described would slide right back beneath the surface where it had been hiding for years. He thought of something Renee used to say long before either of them had ever imagined a moment like this. She used to tell him not to ask how people would treat him once they learned he had power, but to watch how they treated him before they knew anything at all. That was the only way to see who someone truly was. So Elijah chose silence. He let Walter Grissom lead him out of the diner in handcuffs, but every word, every witness, and every running camera stayed locked in his memory, waiting for the moment they would matter most. The parking lot outside had gone quiet in the particular way crowd goes quiet when it senses something is wrong, but hasn't yet decided whether to say so out loud. Grissom walked Elijah out into the morning light with a grip on his arm, firmer than necessary. And the moment they cleared the doorway, he turned to address the small crowd on the sidewalk. He wanted witnesses, but only the kind who'd remember the story the way he intended to tell it. "This man was watching the police station," Grissom announced, loud enough for everyone within 50 feet to hear. "A stranger sits by the window, keeps an eye on our patrol cars, refuses a lawful order. I don't care if he wants to call himself a father or a government employee. None of that matters when a man won't cooperate." Elijah kept his voice level, refusing to give Grissom the reaction he seemed to be fishing for. "I never refused a lawful order. I refused to give up a table you don't own." The sentence landed flat and calm, which only seemed to irritate Grissom further, because a man who stayed composed was harder to paint as dangerous. Grissom turned to Roy Duncan and told him to note in the report that Elijah had been argumentative and hostile. Duncan nodded and pulled out his notepad without asking a single question, the way a man does when he's spent years following orders without needing to understand them. Jason Pierce stood a few feet away, his body camera still recording, and Elijah caught him glancing at it, then back at Elijah, as if some part of him already knew the footage didn't match what Grissom was describing out loud. A man named Frank Delaney had pulled out his phone and started recording from a distance, careful to keep it low against his hip. When Duncan's eyes drifted toward him, Frank lowered the phone immediately and slid it back into his pocket, the fear on his face plain enough that nobody needed to ask why. An older woman near the diner's entrance leaned toward the woman beside her and murmured that just last week she'd watched Grissom laugh and wave 3 white teenagers through that very same table without a second glance. Carol, still holding a coffee pot from inside, heard it clearly but said nothing, her eyes fixed on the pavement. Elijah understood, standing there with his wrists bound, that whatever prejudice existed in Cedar Ridge didn't announce itself with slurs or signs. It lived instead in the quiet arithmetic of who got treated as a customer and who got treated as a threat, who got to ask a question and who got punished for asking the same one. A white man declining to give up a table was rude. Elijah declining was aggressive. A white man asking why was curious. Elijah asking why was defying authority. The rules never changed on paper, only in practice, and only depending on who was standing in front of them. At 7:58, Elijah's phone lit up in his jacket pocket with a voicemail notification. He couldn't reach it with his hands cuffed behind him, but Grissom noticed the screen brighten and pulled the phone out to look. A photo of Zoe filled the lock screen, smiling in her school uniform, and beneath it, the beginning of a message from her about her presentation that morning. Grissom studied the picture a moment before looking back at Elijah with something close to satisfaction. "You should be thinking about your daughter before you let the police have to deal with you like this," Grissom said. For the first time since he'd walked into the diner, Elijah felt something sharpen in his chest, a flash of anger he had to work to keep out of his voice. "Don't bring her into this." Grissom smiled slightly, reading the reaction as a crack in Elijah's composure rather than what it actually was, a father's instinct to protect the one thing that mattered more to him than his own dignity. "Then start acting like a responsible parent," Grissom said, and turned back toward the crowd as if the exchange had proven something. Elijah said nothing further. He kept his eyes on the phone still in Grissom's hand, and he waited because he knew what was coming at 8 o'clock, and he knew it was going to matter more than anything Grissom had said all morning. At 8, exactly, the phone rang. The screen showed no name, only a secured number Elijah recognized instantly as the line used by his federal security detail. Grissom looked down at the ringing phone, then at Elijah, and something like curiosity crossed his face before he decided, without asking permission from anyone, that he was going to answer it himself. "Hello?" Grissom said, holding the phone slightly away from his ear, as if expecting a lawyer or an angry relative. The voice on the other end belonged to Diane Whitaker, the agent in charge of Elijah's security coordination, calling in for the scheduled safety check his position required every morning. He traveled without a full detail. "This is a scheduled check-in," Diane said. "I need to confirm the safety code with the individual assigned to this line." Grissom's tone shifted into something almost amused. "The owner of this phone is currently in police custody. If you're his lawyer, you can call back later." Diane didn't raise her voice. "I need to speak with Elijah Monroe directly." "He's not in a position to take calls right now," Grissom answered, glancing toward Elijah as if enjoying the moment. Diane's next question came without any hesitation. "Who am I speaking with?" "Sheriff Walter Grissom, Cedar Ridge Police Department." "Where are you holding Elijah Monroe?" "Right outside a diner on Main Street. He's being detained for obstruction and surveilling a police facility." There was a silence on the line long enough that Grissom pulled the phone away from his ear to check whether the call had dropped, giving the command center on the other end time to verify the location and quietly trigger an alert. When Diane spoke again, her voice had changed entirely, stripped of any patience. "Sheriff Grissom, listen to me very carefully. You are currently holding the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Do not move him. Do not search his vehicle. Do not power down any cameras on scene. Grissom laughed a short, disbelieving sound and looked over Elijah's plain jacket and worn boots as though the words made no sense. The director of the FBI doesn't look like this. Elijah met his eyes directly, his voice quiet but unmistakably firm. You just said out loud the thing you'd been trying to hide from the very beginning. Grissom's smile faded as the weight of what he'd just admitted on a recorded federal line settled over him. He ended the call almost immediately, but there was no undoing what had already happened. The conversation had confirmed exactly who was in custody, captured Grissom's own words on record, pinpointed the location down to the sidewalk outside the diner, and triggered a federal response team stationed 31 miles away. From that exact moment, though, Grissom didn't yet understand it, the balance of power in Cedar Ridge had already begun to shift away from him. He stood there a few seconds with the phone still in his hand, his expression cycling through disbelief, calculation, and something close to panic before he forced his face back into a mask of authority. He handed the phone back to Duncan without a word and turned toward the crowd, telling them the situation was under control. Though his voice had lost some of the certainty it carried only minutes earlier, Jason Pierce, still standing off to the side, kept his camera rolling and said nothing, watching his boss try to rebuild a story that was already falling apart in real time. Grissom understood exactly what was coming, and he began giving orders with the urgency out of a man trying to outrun a clock he could no longer see. He told Duncan to search Elijah's rental car parked near the diner. He ordered Pierce to shut down his body camera. He demanded that Carol hand over every second of surveillance footage from inside the restaurant. He instructed Duncan to write up a report describing Elijah as increasingly aggressive, and he wanted Elijah moved inside the station before any federal agents arrived to complicate things. Pierce didn't move toward his camera. It uploads automatically to the server, he said, his voice steady despite the fear visible in his posture. I can't delete it even if I wanted to. Grissom stepped closer, his voice dropping into something quieter and more threatening. If you want to keep wearing that badge, you might want to remember who pinned it on you. Pierce held his ground, and something in his silence carried more weight than any argument could have. It was the first time in his career he'd refused a direct order from Walter Grissom, and though his hands were shaking slightly at his sides, he didn't reach for the camera. Duncan, meanwhile, searched the rental car with the kind of thoroughness meant to manufacture a justification after the fact. What he found instead was a framed photo of Elijah's family, a crayon drawing Zoe had made for him before the trip, a rental agreement with his real name printed clearly across the top, and a small box holding Renee's wedding ring, which Elijah still carried with him on trips like this one. There was no weapon. There was no evidence of any wrongdoing. Still, Grissom instructed Duncan to write that Elijah possessed unspecified materials related to a government facility, a phrase vague enough to sound suspicious to anyone who hadn't seen what was actually sitting in that car. Elijah watched all of it unfold with a strange quiet clarity, recognizing that Grissom was constructing a false narrative in real time in front of dozens of witnesses who'd already seen enough to know better. Grissom ordered him placed into the back of a patrol car, and Duncan opened the rear door, one hand on Elijah's shoulder, guiding him toward it. Before Elijah's foot ever crossed into the vehicle, the sound of engines rose from the far end of the street, low and fast and growing louder by the second. 3 black SUVs turned the corner and swept into the parking lot, sealing off every direction a vehicle could leave. Agents stepped out in coordinated movements, controlled rather than aggressive, the kind of arrival built to secure a scene rather than start a confrontation. Diane stepped first, holding up her federal credentials for the entire crowd to see. Federal Bureau of Investigation, this scene is being secured. Nobody is to leave the area. Her voice carried across the parking lot with an authority that made even Grissom's deputies straighten instinctively. Grissom tried to reassert control, his voice rising. Your man was arrested according to procedure. Diane ignored him entirely and turned to Elijah, her expression softening only slightly. Director, do you require medical attention? The entire parking lot went silent. Somewhere behind Elijah, someone exhaled audibly as though the truth had finally landed on everyone at once. Grissom turned toward him, something between confusion and desperation crossing his face. Why didn't you say something? Elijah answered without raising his voice. I told you exactly where my wallet was. You never checked because you'd already decided who I was before you ever asked my name. Diane moved quickly, photographing the cuffs still around Elijah's wrists, documenting his position, cataloging the scene before ordering the restraints removed. Elijah didn't linger in them for effect. He let the process unfold exactly as it needed to, understanding that precision now mattered more than anything he could say. Once the cuffs came off, he made a point of clarifying his role to everyone standing nearby, insisting that he was a witness in this matter and would not be directing the investigation personally. "Don't investigate how they treated the director of the FBI," Elijah said, loud enough for the gathered agents and bystanders to hear clearly. "Investigate how they treat someone they think has nobody standing behind them." For a brief moment, it felt as though justice might arrive quickly and cleanly, the kind of resolution that matched the shock of the morning's events. That feeling didn't last. Grissom wasn't arrested on the spot. Within the hour, his attorney arrived at the station, and the counterattack began almost immediately, sharp and coordinated in a way that suggested it had been prepared long before this particular morning. The attorney argued that Elijah had traveled to Cedar Ridge without any official warrant or authorization. He argued that Elijah had concealed his identity throughout the encounter. He suggested that Elijah held a personal grudge against Grissom, stemming from nothing more than a disagreement over a table, and he claimed the federal government was abusing its power to retaliate against a local sheriff who'd simply been doing his job. Grissom, in the narrow window before the department servers were locked down by federal order, filed an official report claiming that Elijah had refused to identify himself, had observed the police station for an extended period, had displayed aggressive behavior, had reached toward his pocket despite being told to stop, and had caused the responding officers to fear for their safety. If that report were taken at face value, the entire morning could be reduced to nothing more than a disagreement between two men, stripped of any pattern, any history, any weight beyond a single misunderstanding at a diner table. Worse still, when investigators reviewed the diner surveillance footage, they discovered 37 seconds missing from exactly the moment Grissom first approached Elijah's table. Duncan's body camera had captured almost nothing useful, the angle conveniently obstructed for most of the encounter. Pierce's footage remained intact, but Grissom's attorney immediately moved to have it excluded, arguing that Pierce had failed to follow proper notification procedures before recording. Local news outlets picked up the story within hours, and the headlines twisted the narrative in exactly the direction Grissom's attorney had hoped. One outlet ran it under the headline, "FBI Director Uses Federal Power After Diner Dispute," framing the entire morning as an abuse of authority rather than an exposure of one. Elijah received a call from Washington shortly afterward, instructing him to leave Cedar Ridge immediately to avoid the appearance of personally influencing an investigation involving his own arrest. At almost the same moment, Zoe called him on video, her face tight with worry in a way that made his chest ache before she even said anything. She'd seen a short clip circulating online, one that showed only the argument between Elijah and Grissom, stripped of everything that came before, stripped of the context that made the truth visible. "Dad," she asked, her voice small, "did you actually cause trouble?" The question hurt more than the handcuffs ever had. Elijah understood in that moment that Grissom was not simply trying to escape accountability. He was trying to recast Elijah as the exact image prejudice always wanted to see: an angry black man dangerous and abusing power, rather than a father who'd simply refused to give up a table. Elijah couldn't use his position to defend himself without making Grissom's accusation look more credible in the process, and that realization left him with no good option but to step back entirely. He'd been ordered to withdraw from any involvement in the investigation, and in that single decision, he lost control over how his own case would be handled. He lost the ability to directly refute Grissom's version of events. He lost, at least temporarily, the trust of a portion of the public reading headlines without context. And for the first time since the whole ordeal began, he saw uncertainty in his own daughter's eyes, which hurt worse than anything Grissom had said to his face. This was the lowest point Elijah had faced since the moment Duncan first pulled him from his chair. Instead of responding with anger, he kept his voice gentle for Zoe's sake. "I don't need you to believe me because of my title," he told her. "I just need you to wait until the whole truth comes out." Zoe's answer came quietly, but it carried more conviction than her earlier question had. "I still believe you, but I want other people to see who you really are too." That single sentence settled something in Elijah that no legal strategy could have. He understood, listening to his daughter, that he couldn't win this fight through power or rank. The only path forward was to let the evidence, the witnesses, and the community itself carry the truth the rest of the way, even if it meant stepping back and trusting people he'd never met to do the right thing when no one was forcing them to. Elijah returned to Washington the same day he was ordered to step back, and the silence of that decision followed him through every hallway of the federal building. He formally withdrew from directing the case, signing the paperwork himself, rather than letting an aide handle it because he wanted no one to say later that he'd tried to quietly keep his hand on the scale. Diane took over the investigation alongside her own team, working without him, while Elijah waited 3 states away for a truth he could no longer shape directly. The early days offered almost nothing to hold on to. The missing 37 seconds of diner footage remained unexplained. Grissom's official report describing Elijah as combative and threatening sat in the system as the only formal account of what had happened. Several residents who'd watched the whole encounter refused to speak with investigators, afraid of what it might cost them in a town where Grissom still controlled every badge on the street. The mayor spoke publicly about protecting Cedar Ridge's reputation rather than addressing what had happened outside the diner. And the local prosecutor said there wasn't yet enough evidence to reopen any of the older cases the original letters had described. Grissom, for his part, held a press conference on the courthouse steps, standing tall in his uniform as though nothing about that morning had shaken him. "I don't see color," he told the small crowd of reporters. "I only see behavior." It was the kind of sentence built to sound reasonable to anyone who hadn't read the 4 letters that started this investigation in the first place. And for a moment, it seemed to work exactly as intended. But Diane had already begun pulling the department's traffic stop records, and the numbers told a story. Grissom's words couldn't undo. Black drivers were stopped at a rate far beyond their share of the local population. White drivers who were stopped tended to leave with a warning. Black drivers were far more likely to have their vehicles searched or to be held on the roadside far longer than the stop required. The word aggressive appeared again and again in reports involving black residents, far more often than in any comparable report involving white residents, even when the attached footage showed no such behavior at all. The numbers proved something larger than any single incident could, that whatever existed in Grissom's mind had long since become an operating pattern inside his department. Still, patterns alone weren't enough to prove exactly what had happened to Elijah on that sidewalk. And for a while, the investigation stalled on that exact point, caught between what everyone suspected and what could actually be shown. The turn came from Jason Pierce. He arrived at the federal office voluntarily without his attorney present and handed over the automatic backup copy of his body camera footage, the one that had uploaded to the department server the moment it was recorded exactly as he'd told Grissom it would. The footage showed everything clearly. It showed Elijah's voice remaining calm through the entire encounter. It showed him stating exactly where his wallet was. It showed Grissom never once checking for it. It captured Grissom calling Elijah a threat before there was ever a shred of evidence to support the claim. And it caught unmistakably the moment Grissom muttered that the director of the FBI didn't look like this. It showed Grissom ordering Pierce to shut off his camera, and it showed Duncan being instructed in plain language to write a report that didn't match what had actually happened. Pierce understood exactly what handing over that footage could cost him. It could end his career in Cedar Ridge before it had truly begun, and would certainly end whatever protection came from staying quiet and loyal to the badge that had trained him. He signed his statement anyway, his hand steady even though his voice shook slightly when he read it aloud for the record. Once Pierce's footage became part of the official file, the silence around town began to crack. Frank Delaney came forward with the video he'd recorded from his phone that morning, the one he'd hidden the moment Duncan glanced his way. Carol produced a backup copy of the diner's register camera, a second angle. Grissom had never known existed one that had captured the missing 37 seconds from a different vantage point entirely. A man named Gerald Combs stepped forward to describe being held for 19 hours without charge, losing a set of work tools that were never returned. A woman named Marion Hayes described watching her son get pulled over 6 times in 3 months without ever once receiving an actual ticket. None of these stories had felt significant enough on their own to challenge a sheriff who'd run the town for 19 years. Together, they stopped looking like isolated complaints and started looking exactly like what they were. Pieces of the same pattern the original letters had tried to describe long before Elijah ever sat down at that table by the window. The final evidence that broke the case wide open was almost mechanical in its bluntness. 14 reports had been edited after they were originally filed. 11 people had been detained without any supporting documentation ever entered into the system. Property logs didn't match what victims said had been taken from them. Black residents continued to appear in stop records described as aggressive at rates the footage simply didn't support. Duncan had a documented habit of disabling his camera before controversial arrests, and the local prosecutor's office, led by Patricia Lowell, had a long history of quietly dismissing complaints that pointed back toward Grissom's department. Grissom was suspended immediately and without ceremony in front of the same station he'd commanded for 19 years. I was made to surrender his weapon, hand over his badge, and remove his own insignia while being informed that he was now the subject of a federal civil rights investigation. 2 days later, Elijah met him on the courthouse steps, flanked by legal counsel and federal agents on both sides in what would be their final conversation as this case moved forward. Grissom still insisted he'd done nothing wrong. "I've helped black folks before," he said, his voice tight with something between defiance and disbelief. "I've arrested plenty of white men, too. You can't call me a racist over one arrest." Elijah answered without raising his voice, the same steadiness that had carried him through the entire ordeal, still present in every word. "Prejudice doesn't disappear just because you treated a few people decently. It shows up in who you give the benefit of the doubt to and who you decide is dangerous before they've even opened their mouth." Grissom tried once more. "If you had just given up the table, none of this would have happened." "No," Elijah said. "If I had given up the table, this would still be happening to the next person who sat down in my place." He let the next sentence land with the full weight of everything that had brought them to this spot. "You didn't fall because you handcuffed the director of the FBI. You fell because you handcuffed too many black people, too many poor people, too many people you assumed nobody would ever call to save." Grissom had no answer left to give. The investigation's final results arrived in the following weeks. Grissom faced federal charges for civil rights violations, falsifying records, and conspiracy to obstruct the investigation. Duncan was charged as an accomplice. Patricia Lowell came under her own investigation for repeatedly ignoring complaints filed against the department. Old cases were reopened one by one. The evidence room was independently audited from top to bottom, and victims were formally given the right to file for compensation. The state temporarily took over operation of the Cedar Ridge Police Department. While a permanent solution was worked out, Jason Pierce did not become sheriff overnight. An official from a neighboring county was brought in as interim sheriff while the department rebuilt itself, and Pierce was assigned to oversee evidence preservation, camera training protocols, and community relations during that transition. It took a full year of reform and a public, transparent selection process before Pierce ever had the chance to run for the position himself, a timeline that felt earned rather than convenient to everyone who'd lived through what came before it. 17 days after that morning at the diner, Elijah returned to Cedar Ridge with Zoe beside him. He wore no suit and arrived in no federal vehicle. Father and daughter walked into the diner like any two customers stopping in for breakfast, and the room went quiet the moment they crossed the threshold, though this silence carried a different weight than the one that had filled the same space weeks earlier. Frank Delaney stood up first. Carol rose next. Gerald Combs and Marion Hayes followed, and one by one, nearly everyone in the diner stood from their seats. Nobody called Elijah director. They stood because he had allowed himself to be seen as a man without power, so that the town could finally see how it treated people who truly had none. Elijah and Zoe sat at the same second table by the window. Carol brought eggs and coffee for Elijah, pancakes for Zoe, and before she walked away, she offered a quiet apology. "I knew it was wrong," she said. "I still stood there and did nothing." "Staying silent out of fear is something people can understand," Elijah told her gently. "But when that silence protects the person causing the harm, we have to decide whether our fear matters more than someone else's safety." Zoe glanced out the window and saw Jason Pierce stepping out of the station across the street. "Is he the one who saved you?" she asked. Elijah shook his head slightly. "Nobody saved me alone. One person kept his camera running. One person handed over a video. One person told the truth about what happened to them. And eventually an entire town stopped pretending it hadn't seen anything at all." After breakfast, Diane arrived and handed Elijah a new case file, and Zoe's expression shifted with quiet worry. "Do you have to leave again?" she asked. Elijah checked his watch, then closed the folder without opening it. "Tomorrow," he said. "Today, I promised you the museum." Father and daughter walked out of the diner together, back into a town that was still learning how to see itself clearly, one honest witness at a time. This story doesn't claim every officer is like Walter Grissom, and it doesn't claim every conflict comes down to race. What it does say is this: the most dangerous kind of prejudice rarely shows up as a slur shouted in public. More often it hides inside a double standard where one person is presumed innocent and another has to prove they aren't a threat simply because of how they look. Grissom didn't fall because he happened to handcuff a powerful man. He fell because he'd spent 19 years handcuffing people he assumed no one would ever call to save. And Elijah didn't win because he was the director of the FBI. He won because Jason Pierce refused to turn off his camera, because Frank Delaney handed over his video, because Carol found the courage to speak, because ordinary people decided that silence was no longer worth the price of someone else's safety. Justice doesn't begin when someone powerful walks through the door. It begins when everyday people decide that the truth of someone with no power at all still deserves to be heard. If this story moved you, don't scroll past it in silence either. Subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments about a time you spoke up